Hey everyone, so yesterday we talked about special weapons. Today we're going to be talking about heavy weapons, and let's get started with machine guns first. Now, some of you know there's a new kid on the block. It's aggressive machine guns, a new archetype. So you might be wondering, how do they stack up against stuff like adaptives, high impacts, rapids, what have you? Well, aggressive machine guns are basically like rapid fire machine guns. They have almost the same DPS and almost the same total damage value. They are closer to rapids than anything else by far. The other two are actually quite far apart, so adaptives and high impacts are a little bit different. I would say most players prefer adaptives and high impact frame machine guns because they have a decent chunk more total damage while not sacrificing too much DPS to red bars. Now, in the grand scheme of things, do I think frame on a machine gun really impacts the end result? Not really. I would say what makes or breaks a great machine gun is going to be the first two columns for the perks. It's going to be the origin trait, and it's going to be like whether or not you can enhance the machine gun, how good it feels, right? And so as a result, machine guns are a little bit unique compared to the other tier list that I have on this spreadsheet, in that the S tier machine guns and the F tier machine guns, there's not like a huge difference between them in terms of how effective they are. S tier machine guns will certainly like feel better, right? You'll avoid manually reloading, they'll have splash perks and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you know, if you need a machine gun just to like kill stuff with your heavy weapon, you know, an E tier, D tier, F tier machine gun will still do the job, just maybe not as conveniently, let's just say, right? So how did I break down my tier list? S and A tier are pretty close to each other. I would say A tier machine guns are kind of like S tier machine guns, but they're missing maybe one or two things that makes them really solid, really versatile. S tier machine guns are characterized by having really diverse perks, so access to great reload perks like reconstruction, demo, subsistence, etc. And then in the second column, we have a solid neutral perk like killing tally, maybe bait and switch, desperate measures, one for all, stuff like that, and maybe access to a splash perk, right? So that's going to be what characterizes S tier machine guns. A tier machine guns maybe have that minus one thing, right? So for example, Speleologist, this thing has access to incandescent and radiolaria transposer, which is excellent. However, it does not really have a really strong neutral reload perk. Envious Assassin requires you to get kills with your other weapons, which is kind of counterintuitive given that machine guns are meant to be kind of soaking up most of the ad clear if you're using them properly, right? So that's going to be the A tier. B tier is going to be machine guns that I think are just solid overall. They have a really solid perk combo. For example, Demo AJ is on like 3 of these. You have like Sub AJ, you have Auto Incand, you have Field Incand on a high impact that's enhanceable, you have Demo AJ, you have Sub 1 for all. These are all really solid perk combinations, but they're just missing maybe one or two things, like a really solid splash perk or, you know, enhanceable perks or something like that. They're just missing maybe like, you know, slightly more than the A tier machine guns, but nonetheless, these are also excellent as well. Finally, we have the C, D, E, and F tiers. I think C is like where things kind of start to fall apart. As you can see, like Shattered Cypher, Quasiphon, and Retrofit. You know, Retrofit and Shattered Cypher don't really have solid, you know, second columns, and you know, their first columns are kind of iffy too. And Quasiphon, I mean, Slideways is kind of a cringe reload perk to have on a machine gun, in my opinion. So again, losing a lot in the C tier. D tier, even more niche. E tier is going to be your, you know, really bare bones machine guns, so like Auto Rampage, Auto Firing Line, Field Demo, Field Dragonfly. And then F tier is going to be kind of bottom of the barrel because you're either running something like Feeding Frenzy, which is strictly a manual reload perk, or Ensemble. And then you have these kind of splash perks or damage perks that are either just okay or kind of niche and conditional, right? So that's going to be the main difference. But if you notice, right, even in the F tier, right, something like Ensemble Golden Tricorn or Ensemble Target Lock or even like Feeding Frenzy Dragonfly, it's going to be usable, right? It's not going to be horrible, right? So really what you're focusing on when it comes to machine guns compared to other weapons is, does this weapon feel good to use? AKA, am I dodging manual reloads, right? And number two, does it have, you know, solid neutral gameplay splash perks or origin traits, or maybe some ad killing kind of lethality perks like Desperate Measures? So that's really what we're going to be looking for on machine guns. But again, the band, the spectrum of S to F tier machine guns is a lot narrower than a lot of the other weapons that we've talked about in the recent past and that we will continue to talk about for the rest of this video. So let's go ahead and look at the machine gun changelog. As you can see, 4 major changes here with a bunch of tier extensions. We talked about tier extensions already in the last video, but if you haven't caught that one yet, basically, tier extensions are, I added E and F tier to this tier list, and everything else has to be moved down to fill up those tiers and make things a little bit more refined when it comes to tier breaks. As for the other 4 things, we have Speleo. I think this is the best incandescent LMG in the game thanks to its origin trait. It's easily one of the most lethal heavy weapons when it comes to ad clear because it has access to incandescent. It's a rapid fire machine gun, so it has very high minor DPS, and it has radiolaria transposer, which is one of the best ad clear origin traits in the game. It's up there with stuff like Cursed Thrall. So I really like Speleo. The only problem that I have with it is that it doesn't have access to something like Demo. If this thing had Demo, it would easily be S tier. Like, no questions asked, it would be S tier. Unfortunately, it has Envious, which is kind of counterintuitive to how a machine gun tends to play. You usually get the kills with the machine gun and not with another weapon. You have Heal Clip, but again, Heal Clip is something that scales proportionally with reload speed and lethality. And while machine guns have a lot of lethality, reload speed is one of the weakest points when it comes to machine guns, right? They're probably top 3 worst weapons in the games when it comes to how good it feels to manually reload them. So unfortunately, you know, you're gonna have to use something like Radiant Dance Machines to really strongly make use of Heal Clip on this weapon, in my opinion. And so as a result, you know, it's not in the S tier, but it's certainly a very solid and interesting pick for sure. We have Pro Memoria. Pro Memoria, again, aggressive frame machine guns are just fine. They have, you know, decent ad clear, DPS, they have decent total damage, and Demo and Desperate Measures is an excellent choice for a machine gun to have. You can run Recon if you want, if you don't want to expend your grenade. There's interesting stuff like, you know, Hatchling Dragonfly. You have Bait and Switch as another potential option for a neutral ad clear perk, and then you have Dealer's Choice. We're going to talk about this when I get to the origin trait and perk tier list later on this season, probably in like the next week or so. But I do think I've overrated Bray Inheritance in the past, and Dealer's Choice is kind of like a pseudo Thresh, especially if you're running another weapon from that family, whether it's something like Still Hunt or the Call. Pretty common weapons in today's meta, so definitely a decent choice, Pro Memoria, as a neutral gameplay machine gun, which is why I put it in the S tier, because it's just got, you know, it's just like bare bones like a great machine gun, right? So that's going to be it for machine guns, I believe. Yeah, Unwavering Duty and Hammerhead. Unwavering Duty, I moved it down one tier because it kind of lacks the same versatility and universal appeal that the S tier machine guns have. For example, you know, Commemoration, you have Recon Tally, excellent. You have Recon Desperate Measures on Pro Memoria. You have like Demo Bait and Switch, Recon Bait and Switch on Song of Your Ute with excellent origin traits. And then you have Unwavering, which has, you know, Auto Incan, Field Incan, Sub Incan, you know, KT, pretty decent, but pretty bad origin trait and no enhanceable perks, right? So that's kind of why I had to knock it down a tier. And then finally, Hammerhead. We're real sticklers about machine gun manual reloads in this tier list. And so unfortunately, Hammerhead, while rewind rounds is good for spamming, eventually you do have to manually reload with rewind rounds. And so no matter what, you are going to end up hitting that roadblock. And because of that, it is going to slow down your gameplay loop at some point. And so while Hammerhead does have a pretty decent origin trait, and it does have some interesting and lethal combos, if you're going to use something like Rampage KT, which is what makes this machine gun unique, you can't use rewind, right? And so it's kind of, you know, it's kind of a toss up there. Certainly an interesting machine gun, and certainly not bad. I do think the S and A tier are very close together on this tier list compared to some of the other ones here. So, you know, don't feel too bad about Hammerhead or anything like that. It's certainly still a good machine gun. I just think it's not as universally applicable as some of the stuff in the S tier. Finally, something that I didn't really note in the changelog, I think I moved Song of Your Ute up in the S tier, even though it was already in the S tier. And I think even Cursed Thrall is like borderline OP on a machine gun. I think you don't even need to build into melee that much to really make good use of it. And if you do, I think you'll be rewarded very heavily. I think it's a great origin trait to have on a machine gun, and that's why I've decided to put it a little bit higher in the S tier compared to where it was last season. Okay. Moving on, let's talk about Heavy GLs. Now, Heavy GLs almost didn't change. We didn't get any new Heavy GLs in Season 24, and so I'll just talk about what I changed, okay? So there's two changes here. Number one, Marcelion C has some potential for Cascade Point rotations or even full court rotations with Still Hunt. And because it surge matches Still Hunt, I've decided to bump it up to A tier. A tier is basically any Heavy GL that is not maybe universally applicable in the same way that a Cataphract or an Edge Transit is, but has some potential for some niche rotations where you are looking for a specific element or a specific role with something like Cascade Point. Next up, we have Hullabaloo. Hullabaloo got enhanceable perks this season, and I do think compressed waveframes are a little bit underrated when it comes to archetypes, and so in the archetype tier list we'll be discussing that, but Hullabaloo is packed with a bunch of cool perks, and yeah, I'm a fan of compressed waves, even though they're not maybe like top of the pack for DPS or anything like that. They're certainly very unique, and I think bottom of A tier is a reasonable place to put it. Certainly I don't think Hullabaloo belongs down here with stuff like Typhon and a Cosmic. Next up, we have Swords. Now, swords are very interesting. I made a lot of changes to the sword tier list this season. I was a lot more careful with my placements. And of course, stuff like Pack Hunter and some of the new swords that we've gotten obviously have shifted placements as well. So let's talk about the tiering system. S tier is going to be any movement sword that also has another purpose. For example, the other half can be used for movement, but it can also be used for surrounded, right? Enhanced surrounded with an adaptive frame heavy attack is something that's unique to the other half. And so that's why it's in the S tier. We also have the two strongest damage We also have the two strongest damage swords in the game. We have Summum Bonum, and of course we have Bequest. I don't really think I need to talk about these. I've talked about them extensively on the channel already, so you probably know why they're already in the S tier. The one thing that I'll mention about Summum Bonum is that even if you're in a team environment, this thing basically turns into an adaptive sword with Chaos Reshaped. So what you can do with this sword is just spam left clicks with Chaos Reshaped, and it will still be better than a sword like Geodetic or a sword like, Zephyr or something like that, because it has access to Adept Impact, and Chaos Reshaped is 5% higher than Whirlwind, on top of being able to preserve your Chaos Reshaped buff completely, even if you swap off the weapon, compared to something like Whirlwind, where if you swap to like Lumina, or maybe, you're the Pack Hunter guy and you're providing Pack Hunter, there's a chance you lose your Whirlwind Blade stacks if you take too long, right? So that's why this is the S tier. A tier is a bit interesting. It's a very small tier, and the reason for that is casters are better DPS than adaptives, right? This is something that I'm not sure many people are familiar with. Casters are slightly better than adaptives when it comes to DPS, and this sword has Relentless, it has Whirlwind, it has Surrounded, it has Attrition. It's basically an all-in-one package deal. If you are new to the game and you need a sword for DPS and you're not looking for Surrounded, you don't have access to Summum, I think Ill Omen is great. You can be on Attrition and help your teammates out. Otherwise, you can just be on Relentless Whirlwind, and it's a solid pick. Obviously, the origin trait doesn't do much for a sword that's not really being used for ad clear, but still pretty helpful nonetheless. Geodetic. Now, Geodetic is an interesting one. Why is a random adaptive sword with Relentless Whirlwind higher than all the other adaptives with Relentless Whirlwind? Well, there are 3 legendary swords in this game that have atypical impact values for their archetype. One of them is Bequest, which we already talked about, has 70 impact compared to the 60 that adaptives normally have, which is why it's so good. You also have Geodetic. Geodetic has 62, which is obviously a lot less than the impact boost from Bequest. It's not 10, it's 2 instead, but it's enough that I decided to put it above the rest of the B tier swords, which have normally 60 impact. The third sword that has a really different impact from what its archetype would suggest is Temptation's Hook, and that's in the wrong direction. It has 46 impact instead of 60, which is why I decided to put it smack into the F tier. Okay. So that aside, let's talk about B tier. B tier is basically all of your swords that are just decent. They're basically the same, right? You have a bunch of Relentless, Surrounded / Whirlwind adaptive swords, which with Double-Edged Answer being at the top because it's enhanceable. And so yeah, these are all basically interchangeable. I mean, I guess you would swap between them if you're running like Master and you want to match like the Activity Surge or something. But yeah, these are all basically interchangeable. You have a Vortex here. The only reason the Vortex is here because it has Attrition, right? So Attrition is kind of nice. If you want to use the sword as an Attrition sword, you want to match Still Hunt or something. Gold Tusk is pretty nice. The light attacks are buffed a lot by Pack Hunter. So Relentless Whirlwind, Lightweight Gold Tusk does similar DPS to like an adaptive sword, spamming light attacks. So it's not too bad. It's certainly not as good as, some of the stuff up here, but it's pretty decent nonetheless. We have our C tier. C tier is going to be kind of the same thing as B tier swords, but less versatile. So either lacking access to Surrounded, so these 3 adaptives, or a worse archetype, so Vortexes. Obviously, Vortexes are worse. Falling Guillotine has double damage perks, but that's the only thing that's like saving it against the adaptives that are up in the B tier. Okay, next up we have the D tier. D tier is going to be bad archetype, so aggressive or Vortex with no Whirlwind, or it's going to be movement only adaptive, or it's going to be a no Whirlwind on the adaptive, right? So that's going to be the D tier, Caretaker, Honor's Edge. You might be wondering why aggressive swords are so low in this tier list, and that's because they don't receive Pack Hunter. For whatever reason, aggressive Ergos do receive Pack Hunter, but legendary aggressive swords do not benefit from Pack Hunter. So because of this, it's kind of a shame, but because of this, they do take a substantial DPS hit, and it's enough to knock them down into the same tier as these swords down here, okay? Finally, we have E and F tier. E tier is going to be swords that do have a damage perk but are bad outside of that. So for example, Lightweight Sword on guard is pretty bad damage perk. Frenzy on a sword is just 15%. You have Dragon Cult Sickle, which has no Relentless Strikes, which is it's really important for a sword to have. And then you have like Hero of Ages. On guard is really bad for sustained DPS. Finally, we have the F tier. F tier is basically no good damage perk or 46 impact Temptation. So I think it's pretty clear why these swords are down here. 46 impact is so little that it's almost like enough to negate the benefit of a damage perk. So really rough for Temptation's Hook, but I hope that makes sense for swords. Not much to really talk about with swords here. I think we've already talked about pretty much everything here. I'm just gonna go over everything, make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep, that's basically it. Oh yeah, Half-Truths moved down a lot because we have a lot of Eager swords that are better than it, more versatile than it, and literally go further than it, right? If we're talking about Vortexes. So yeah, that is why Half-Truths is where it is. Okay. Next up, we have Rockets. Now, Rockets, almost nothing changed. We got one new Rocket, and Crowning Duologue has a new perk pool. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about these. Crux Termination has moved into the S tier because of bipod swapping, and it's also enhanceable, right? So not only is it enhanceable, you get better versions of the perks that you already know and love, but bipod swapping allows you to run essentially 15 rockets on max reserves, I believe, with this thing. So you can have 15 fully buffed explosive light or surrounded or whatever you choose rockets on this thing, which is really, really great in any activity that you're allowed to swap perks in. I don't know if Bungie's going to patch this the same way they're patching like Cascade Point on Edge Transit next patch, but yeah, Crux Termination, pretty good stuff. And obviously Apex is a little bit less relevant in the meta now because I think Galley and rockets are kind of reduced in their viability when it comes to team DPS outside of optimal scenarios. So Crux is really great, good for GM roaming, good for, you know, ad clear, and good for damage as well. Okay, next up, we have a couple other changes. Faith Keeper, I added to the A tier. Now, Faith Keeper is a precision rocket, so you might be surprised to see it in the A tier. You might be surprised to see Crowning Duologue in the A tier as well. I think rockets in general, right, as a rule of thumb, have kind of moved away from their kind of team DPS role and kind of moved more into like an ad clear role. But even then, like prismatic abilities are just dominating the sandbox so much that people don't really run like rockets in optimized GM runs anymore. It's more like you run like an eager edge sword, or you run like an exotic heavy or something like that, and you run like abilities for ad clear. So, you know, rockets are kind of in an awkward situation. But that being said, you know, bipod rockets with really high reserves like precisions and high impacts, which get 12 at base, are really nice, right? And Faith Keeper, for, you know, for it being a precision rocket, it does less damage, but realistically speaking, you're kind of just spamming this thing. It doesn't really matter that it does a little bit less damage per rocket. And Radiolaria Transposer is a great origin trait to have on like an ad clear weapon, which is going to be getting a ton of kills in a short duration, which matches what Radiolaria Transposer is looking for exactly, right? So Clown Bipod, Field Bipod, you know, have explosive light, stuff like that too. Pretty cool. Crowning Duologue is kind of in the same boat, right? Recon Bipod, Demo Bipod. You have Dreamwork as well for some overflow cool activities as well. So yeah, not going to hate on Faith Keeper and Crowning Duologue. I think they kind of rise to the occasion of what I think rockets are kind of good for now, which is just encounters where maybe you have a bunch of yellow bars and you need to handle them effectively in like a day one scenario. You might pull out, you know, bipod rockets for something like that. Moving past the A tier, you're going to notice a distinct lack of bipod in any tier that's B and below. And that's because, as we talked about, rockets are largely kind of like ad clear options if they're not going to be like the optimal damage options. So B tier is going to be stuff that maybe you could use in like a GM, so high impacts, aggressives, you know, stuff with high reserves, or it's going to be adaptives that have, you know, pretty good perks like Field Prep and Frenzy, stuff like that. B tier is going to be the tier for those rockets. C tier and D tier, I mean, again, I didn't separate rockets too much because they're pretty similar as you move down to the bottom. You have precision frames that don't have access to bipod. You have Heretic and Shining Sphere, which of course don't really have any good second column perks. And then finally, in the bottom tier, in D tier, you have stuff like Field Prep Clown, you know, Royal Entry. You have Impulse Explosive Light Ascendancy with no good reload perk. You have Sub-Zero Salvo with Ambitious and Cluster. Yeah, so the worst archetype with pretty mediocre perks. And so that's why these are going to be occupying the D tier. And finally, we're going to move on to our last category of heavy weapon, which is going to be linears. Now, linears, we did get a couple new linears this season. I believe we got Scintillation, we got Line in the Sand, and we got Suspectum 4FR. Now, linears, I did also spread these as well. I wasn't really able to segment any more than this to create an F tier. I mean, there's only like, what, like 16 linears in the game, so, or no, sorry, even 15 linears in the game, so definitely probably not enough to have like, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tiers. Yeah, doesn't really make sense. So let's briefly talk about these things. Why is Scintillation in S tier, and why did Doom Petitioner get moved down to A tier? The reason for that is because Precision Instrument was the main reason why Doom Petitioner was a solid option as just a neutral linear pick, right? You get up to 30% damage increase after just 2 bursts. However, Bungie nerfed Precision Instruments on aggressive frame linears, or on adaptive burst frame linears. I suppose I'll update this. But Bungie nerfed Precision Instrument so that it only gets 1 stack per burst. And so you essentially need to dump like a quarter of your reserves to get up to a 30% perk. And then you have Scintillation, which comes in, which is the exact same archetype as Doom Petitioner, except it gives you a 30% perk right off the bat because it's bait and switch, right? So because of that, Precision Instrument, you know, undoubtedly moves down a tier. Rewind Rounds is also excellent on adaptive burst frame linears, so I'm not going to complain about that. You have Cornered Surrounded, which is kind of like a bait combo. Like, you're not really going to use this. Like, if you're surrounded, I would probably not recommend using a linear. But regardless, even just the Rewind bait roll and Vice Stinger as well is just better than Doom Petitioner, Cataclysmic, Briar's Contempt, stuff like that. much more universally applicable. Linears are obviously still in a pretty bad state right now. I basically wouldn't use them for anything. But if you want to look at the best linear, it kind of just has to be scintillation, right? Like it's just kind of an obvious choice. So now that we talked about scintillation, let's just briefly go over the other tiers. So in your A tier, you're going to have either your very specialized high DPS linears like Briar's Contempt with Rewind Surrounded and Harmonic Resonance. And then you have your two kind of universally applicable linears, which can be used for swap DPS, or you can use them for just straight firing like PI. So that's going to be the A tier. B tier is going to be your linears that have decent DPS, but lack good total damage from good perks, right? So for example, Clown Cartridge, Firing Line, Storm Chaser is pretty decent, but a 20% perk is going to hurt its total damage compared to something like Bait and Switch on Scintillation. Line in the Sand has Clown Bait, which is pretty decent, but it also struggles because it's a precision frame linear compared to adaptive burst linears, which just have higher DPS naturally. The C tier is basically like the Reeds tier. You have like triple tap firing. Here you have a slightly better perk in precision instrument, you know, potentially a better perk, but it does have Envious Assassin instead of triple tap, which is, you know, worse for total damage. You have Field Prep Frenzy on an aggressive frame linear, right, which ends up being like probably similar DPS to the other options here. Just at a lower total damage cost because it doesn't have triple tap because it's an adaptive burst linear. We have D tier. D tier is just going to be your kind of like, it's like Thread and Needle tier, right? Anything that's like, you know, Frenzy, Focus Fury, it's a precision linear and doesn't have triple tap, right? And finally, you have your E tier. E tier is just going to be your really bad tier. I think everyone's familiar with these two linears and how bad they are. They're very old. Tarantula has Field Prep Box Breathing, and of course there's Wrath with Moving Target and High Impact Reserves. Just very, very old linears. I think these were like the first two to come out, so makes sense that they're all the way at the bottom of the list here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the changelog. Yeah, Scintillation, we talked about. Line in the Sand, Suspectum, Doom Petitioner, Precision Instrument nerf, and Cataclysmic got shifted down because it's not deserving of being in the same tier as Scintillation. Yeah, that is basically it. I believe we've talked about all of the heavy weapons, so hopefully that wasn't too long. Tomorrow we're going to talk about primaries, and then we're going to move on to exotic weapons, which I think will be potentially a little bit controversial with how I've approached it this season. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you tomorrow.